A Civil War soldier could survive a battle, surrender, and still enter the most dangerous part of his war. For a Union prisoner sent to Andersonville, danger waited behind a wooden stockade in Georgia. The camp had been built for about 10,000 men. At its worst, more than 30,000 were crowded inside. There were no proper barracks. Men built shelters from sticks, scraps of cloth, and mud. They drank from a stream that became increasingly polluted. Nearly 13,000 prisoners died before the camp closed. For a Confederate prisoner sent to Rock Island, the danger looked different. The camp stood on an island in the Mississippi River, surrounded by cold water and winter wind. It had barracks, bunks, kitchens, and a hospital. Yet men still died from smallpox, pneumonia, exposure, hunger, and poor sanitation. Nearly 2,000 Confederate prisoners never left the island alive. Both camps became symbols of suffering. Only one became the most infamous prison of the Civil War. So how should we compare them? Was Andersonville worse because its death toll was so much higher? Did Rock Island earn its later reputation as the Andersonville of the North? Or does that label hide the real history of both places? The answer begins before either prison opened. It begins with a decision that trapped thousands of captured soldiers behind walls, the collapse of prisoner exchanges. At the beginning of the Civil War, neither the United States nor the Confederacy had a reliable system for holding large numbers of enemy soldiers. Captured men were often exchanged quickly. A private could be traded for another private. Officers could be exchanged for officers of similar rank. Some prisoners were released on parole, meaning they promised not to fight until a formal exchange took place. The arrangement was uneven and improvised, but it kept many prisoners from spending long periods in captivity. By the summer of 1862, the Union and Confederacy had created a formal exchange agreement known as the Dix Hill Cartel. It was meant to bring order to the process. Prisoners could be exchanged according to rank. Larger groups could be released. Both armies could reduce the burden of feeding, guarding, and transporting captives. For a while, the system worked. Then the war became larger, harder, and more political. The central issue was the treatment of black Union soldiers. The Confederacy often refused to recognize captured black troops as legitimate prisoners of war. Some men risked being enslaved, killed, or forced into labor. The United States government insisted that men serving in Union uniform had to receive equal treatment. By late 1863, the exchange system was breaking down. The dispute over black Union prisoners made a full return to the old system impossible. This decision had consequences far beyond Washington. Prison populations began to rise on both sides. Each new campaign produced more captives. Each battle created another group of men who could no longer be exchanged and sent home. The Confederacy faced the worst logistical crisis. Its railroads were under strain. Food supplies were shrinking. Medicines were scarce. Union armies were moving deeper into Southern territory, cutting transportation routes and damaging farms, depots, and infrastructure. The Union had more resources, but it was not prepared to house thousands of Confederate prisoners safely either. Camps in the North filled quickly. Some were built in former army posts, others were built from scratch. Many were rushed into service before sanitation, drainage, heating, hospitals, and food systems were ready. Andersonville and Rock Island emerged from this crisis. Rock Island opened first, in December of 1863. It was a Union prison camp on an island in the Mississippi River between Illinois and Iowa. Andersonville opened in February of 1864. It was a Confederate prison camp in rural Georgia, built as Southern authorities searched for a place to hold growing numbers of Union captives. Neither camp began as a plan to create suffering. Both began as answers to overcrowding elsewhere. But building a prison is easier than keeping prisoners alive. A camp needs more than fences, guards, and barracks. It needs clean water, dependable food, dry ground, medical care, clothing, fuel, drainage, transportation, and enough space for the population inside. When those systems fail, the prison itself becomes dangerous. Andersonville and Rock Island failed in different ways because they were built in different worlds. One camp stood in the heat of Georgia, where the prison population grew beyond control. The other stood on a northern river island, where winter and disease arrived before the camp was ready. Andersonville, officially called Camp Sumter, was built in a wooded area of Georgia near a rail line. The Confederacy wanted a prison away from the coast and far from Union raids. The location was chosen partly because it seemed secure. Prisoners could be brought in by train, and the surrounding countryside appeared capable of supporting the camp. The camp was designed for about 10,000 prisoners. It was a stockade, a large enclosure surrounded by high wooden walls. Inside, there were no real barracks for the prisoners. The open ground was supposed to hold men who would create temporary shelters for themselves. That design became a disaster once the population exploded. Prisoners used branches, blankets, bits of canvas, old clothing, and scraps of wood to make tiny shelters. Men who had nothing slept in the open. Rain turned the ground into mud. Summer heat gave prisoners little relief. Illness spread through a population with no way to separate the healthy from the sick. A creek ran through the stockade. It was meant to provide water. As more prisoners arrived, it became polluted by washing, waste, and the sheer pressure of so many men living in a confined area. Andersonville was built around a basic assumption that quickly failed. The prison would remain small enough to manage. Rock Island looked more organized. The Union built the prison camp on Arsenal Island, later known as Rock Island Arsenal. The island offered natural security. The Mississippi River surrounded it, making escape difficult. Rail connections allowed the Union to move prisoners and supplies to the site. The camp had 84 wooden barracks. Each building was designed to hold roughly 120 prisoners. There were bunks, windows, doors, ventilators, kitchens, and stoves. The Union also built guard facilities, a hospital, a laundry, and other support structures. Compared with Andersonville, Rock Island seemed far more prepared. But the prison opened during the winter of 1863 into 1864. Confederate prisoners arrived from the South with clothing that was often too thin for the climate. The barracks were unfinished or poorly equipped in the early months. Fuel, blankets, warm clothing, and medical supplies became urgent needs. The Illinois winter turned the island into a harsh place to be confined. The camp also suffered from poor drainage. Water gathered in low areas. Mud and waste created sanitation problems. Crowded barracks made respiratory diseases and contagious infections easier to spread. The prisoners in both camps faced confinement. Their daily experience, however, was shaped by different dangers. At Andersonville, a man could wake under a makeshift shelter, walk across mud, wait in line for food, drink from a contaminated stream, and return to the same overcrowded ground. At Rock Island, a man could wake in a crowded wooden barracks, face wind coming off the river, struggle to stay warm, watch smallpox or pneumonia spread through the camp, and wonder whether the next ration would be enough to keep him going. The two camps had different structures. Their prisoners faced the same basic question: how long could a weakened body survive? The answer depended on food, water, shelter, weather, and health. None of those things could be separated from the others. The next part of the story takes us inside the daily routine, where a ration, a blanket, or a drink of water could decide whether a prisoner had any strength left by nightfall. At Andersonville, hunger was a constant part of prison life. The Confederate government was struggling to feed its own armies and civilians. Prisoners received rations that often relied on cornmeal and small amounts of meat. The food could be spoiled, insufficient, or difficult to prepare. Fresh vegetables were scarce. The lack of variety had serious consequences. Men lost weight. Their muscles weakened. Their wounds healed slowly. Their immune systems became less able to resist illness. Scurvy appeared because prisoners lacked fresh food. A disease that might have been manageable under better conditions became deadly in a crowded camp where almost every man was already exhausted. Water added another layer of danger. The creek inside Andersonville was used for drinking, washing, bathing, and waste disposal. Prisoners knew the water was unsafe. Many had no alternative. A man suffering from diarrhea needed water, but the water itself could worsen the illness. The camp had a deadline, a boundary about 19 feet inside the stockade wall. Prisoners who crossed it risked being shot by guards. The deadline was there to prevent escapes. For prisoners, it was another part of daily life that required caution. A confused, sick, or desperate man could move too close. Guards had orders. The consequences could be fatal. At Rock Island, the prison routine had more structure. Prisoners lived in barracks instead of open ground. They received rations through a union system that had greater access to food than the Confederacy did. That advantage was real, but it did not guarantee humane conditions. Prisoners complained about inadequate food, poor quality supplies, insufficient clothing, and the cold. The Union camp had stoves, but a stove did little if there was not enough fuel or if too many men crowded into a poorly built barracks. Men who had marched and fought in southern climates found themselves trapped through an Illinois winter with little protection from snow, wind, and freezing temperatures. Cold transformed ordinary hardship. A hungry man uses more energy to stay warm. A sick man becomes weaker. A wet blanket becomes dangerous. A poor night of sleep becomes another step toward exhaustion. The camp's drainage problems made matters worse. Mud and standing water became part of everyday life. The island had a river around it, but water nearby did not guarantee sanitation. Poor drainage and crowding created conditions that allowed disease to thrive. The daily rhythm in both camps followed the same grim pattern. Wake up, assess your body, find food, find water, try to stay dry, try to stay warm, or try to escape the heat. Try to keep what little you own. Try not to become sick. Prisoners did not experience their captivity as a grand political issue. They experienced it through small decisions, whether to trade a button for food, whether to use precious cloth for a blanket or a bandage, whether to stand in a line while weak, whether to risk drinking water that might make them worse. This is where the comparison between Andersonville and Rock Island becomes more complicated. Andersonville's conditions were worse overall. Its population was vastly larger than it could safely hold. Its lack of barracks, polluted water, inadequate food, and inadequate medical resources created a crisis that touched nearly everyone in the camp. Rock Island had more buildings and more access to supplies, yet prisoners still faced hunger, cold, and sanitation failures. A camp can look organized from a distance and still become deadly when disease enters crowded living quarters. Before the prison had settled into a stable routine, smallpox began moving through the camp. The outbreak showed how quickly a prison with barracks and guards could become a place of mass death. The medical disaster at Rock Island began with smallpox. In the winter of 1863 into 1864, the disease spread among prisoners and guards. Smallpox was feared for good reason. It was contagious, painful, and often fatal. In a crowded prison camp, one infected person could expose many others before officials understood the scale of the outbreak. By early 1864, nearly 700 prisoners and guards had died in connection with the epidemic. Camp officials isolated the sick and expanded medical facilities. Within months, the outbreak began to slow. The response did not erase the losses. It did show one major difference between Rock Island and Andersonville. Rock Island had access to a larger medical and transport network. It could create separate spaces for the sick. It could bring in more resources. Its system was strained and flawed, but it had some ability to adapt. At Andersonville, disease did not come as one contained outbreak. It spread through the entire environment. Diarrhea and dysentery were major killers. The crowded stockade, unsafe water, lack of sanitation, and poor nutrition created conditions where intestinal disease could move quickly and recoveries were difficult. Typhoid fever, pneumonia, gangrene, scurvy, and other illnesses added to the suffering. The camp hospital could not keep up. Doctors and attendants faced more sick men than they could treat. Medical knowledge in the 1860s was limited everywhere. Andersonville added overwhelming numbers, shortages of supplies, poor food, contaminated water, and a prisoner population that had little chance to regain strength. A prisoner might begin with cramps and weakness, then he could become dehydrated, then fever might follow. By that point, his body could be too weak to stand in a ration line, walk to the water source, or protect himself from the weather. The camp's death rate rose with terrifying speed. During its 14 months of operation, Andersonville held about 45,000 Union prisoners. Nearly 13,000 died. Rock Island held more than 12,000 Confederate prisoners during its existence. About 1,964 died. Both figures represent human beings. Both camps left cemeteries filled with men who had surrendered and never returned home. The numbers also show why Andersonville became the defining symbol of Civil War prison suffering. At Andersonville, more men died than the total number of prisoners who passed through Rock Island. Rock Island's death rate was roughly 16%. Andersonville's was close to 29%. The difference is large enough that calling Rock Island the Andersonville of the North creates a false impression of equality. Rock Island was deadly. Andersonville was catastrophic. Yet the comparison should not turn into a contest that makes one group of dead men seem less important than another. Confederate prisoners at Rock Island faced smallpox, cold, pneumonia, hunger, and confinement. Their families received letters describing sickness and fear. The cemetery on the island remains evidence of that suffering. Union prisoners at Andersonville faced a prison population that grew beyond the camp's capacity. Open ground without proper shelter, polluted water, severe malnutrition, and disease on a massive scale. The conditions were different. The grief was not. Other prisons across the war showed the same larger failure. Elmira in New York had a death rate approaching 1/4 of its prisoners. Camp Douglas in Chicago became notorious for disease and poor conditions. Belle Isle and Libby Prison became symbols of hardship for Union captives in Confederate hands. Across the Civil War, around 56,000 prisoners died in captivity. That number forces us to look beyond famous battlefields. The prison system became another front in the war. It had its own supply failures, its own death toll, and its own victims. When the war ended, Andersonville became a national symbol. Rock Island became a quieter memory. The reasons had as much to do with politics and public memory as they did with the camps themselves. In the spring of 1865, the Civil War ended. Prisoners were released. Survivors returned home. Families searched for names, graves, and answers. Union survivors of Andersonville brought back stories of hunger, filth, sickness, fear, and death. Some survivors were photographed after their release. Their bodies were painfully thin. The images spread through northern newspapers and public life. Americans saw evidence of captivity in a way they had not seen before. Andersonville became more than a prison camp. It became a symbol of everything people believed the Confederacy had done to Union soldiers. Captain Henry Wirtz, the commandant of Andersonville, was tried by a military commission after the war. He was convicted and executed. His trial gave the public a single face to connect with a much larger disaster. Wirtz held responsibility for his role in the camp. At the same time, Andersonville cannot be explained by one man alone. The disaster grew from several forces working together. The collapse of prisoner exchanges, Confederate shortages, broken transportation, a camp population far beyond capacity, limited medical care, and a war that had pushed Southern resources toward failure. The prisoners paid the price for every one of those failures. Rock Island did not produce the same national reckoning. The Union had won the war. Its prison camps did not become central to the victorious country's public memory in the same way. Confederate families remembered Rock Island, Elmira, Camp Douglas, and other northern prisons. But their stories carried less political power in the immediate aftermath of defeat. That is one reason the phrase Andersonville of the North became attractive. It gave Southern memory a way to describe the loss. It also suggested that suffering had been equal on both sides. The historical record does not support that exact comparison. Andersonville had the highest death toll of any Civil War prison camp. It held a much larger population than Rock Island. It had fewer physical resources, weaker sanitation, less shelter, more severe overcrowding, and a much higher mortality rate. Rock Island still deserves serious attention because nearly 2,000 men died there. Those deaths came from real failures: a severe smallpox epidemic, cold weather, poor conditions, inadequate clothing, crowding, and weak sanitation. The camps should be compared honestly. Andersonville shows how quickly a prison can become a humanitarian disaster when a collapsing government tries to confine tens of thousands of men without enough food, shelter, clean water, or medicine. Rock Island shows that buildings, railroads, and greater national resources do not automatically protect prisoners. A camp can have barracks and still fail when winter, disease, crowding, and poor preparation overwhelm the people inside. For the prisoners, these were not debates about mortality rates. A Union soldier at Andersonville worried about finding drinkable water. A Confederate soldier at Rock Island worried about the cold, the next outbreak, and whether he had enough clothing to survive the night. Both men had already fought their battles. Both had surrendered. Both had expected captivity to remove them from the immediate danger of war. Instead, prison became another form of war. It demanded endurance without glory. It punished the sick, the hungry, and the weak. It turned ordinary needs into daily risks. It left families waiting for letters that sometimes never came. Andersonville was worse by the measures that matter most: scale, mortality, overcrowding, shelter, sanitation, and the number of men who died in a short period of time. Rock Island was different, but it was never harmless. The two camps reveal the same hard truth. Surrender did not always bring safety. For thousands of Civil War prisoners, the war continued behind fences, in barracks, beside contaminated water, and in hospital wards where men fought for one more day after they had already put down their weapons.